Hello, we welcome you to the program today. If you will, please turn in your Bibles to Esther chapter 5. We'll begin with Esther chapter 5 and verses 1 through 8 today. Verse 1. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. In verses 1 through 8, we see Esther's banquet. To remind ourselves, turn to Esther 4 and 15. Esther 4 and 15 from the last chapter. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." That brings us to the big day that Esther would go before the king. And so in chapter 5 and verse 1, Esther fasted until the third day. Esther 4:16. While the text does not say, she may have been wearing sackcloth, as did Mordecai and the other Jews as they fasted in Esther chapter 4, 1 through 3. She then put on her royal robe. Esther went and stood in the inner court of the king. The king's palace had what was called the king's house and the inner court. The king sat on his royal throne in the king's house, facing the entrance from the inner court. Meanwhile, Esther stood in the inner court, waiting for either death or life from the pronouncement of the king. Esther chapter 4 and verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king for these 30 days. And so we learn from that passage in Esther 4:11 that Esther made it clear that everybody knew at the time that if anybody approached the king without first being summoned or called, then that meant death, unless the king held out his scepter and they touched the scepter. They were pardoned. Chapter 5, verse 2. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. What must Esther have been feeling at this time as she waited in the court? Would she die or would she live? King Ahasuerus saw Queen Esther standing in the inner court. And as I said, if one came to the king without first being called, he or she would only live if the king held out the golden scepter, his staff. Esther 4 and verse 11. The king was pleased, and so he held out the golden scepter to Esther. So far, things were going well for Esther. She then went near and touched the top of the scepter. Verse 3. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." The king must have reasoned that she wanted something, or else she would not have risked death coming to him without first being summoned. He promised to grant to her request up to half the kingdom. This open-ended offer was a hyperbole to show his generosity as king. Verse 4. So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Esther did not immediately do as Mordecai had said earlier for Esther to do, that is, to make supplication to the king and to plead before the king for her people. Esther 4 and verse 8. Instead, she requested that the king and that Haman come to a banquet that she prepared for the king. We might ask, why did she delay? Why did she delay giving her actual request, her true petition? She seems to be proceeding very deliberately. It may have been that she knew that the king would be pleased with a banquet, and so she first made a banquet to further gain the king's favor. It may also be that she invited Haman, knowing his pride, that she might use his pride to her own advantage. The text doesn't say. Verse 5. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So Esther prepared the banquet for the king. Esther 5:4. Her request was that the king and Haman come to the banquet. The king called for Haman to be brought quickly so that Haman could do as Esther had requested. Bring Haman quickly. He probably sent his eunuchs to hasten to bring Esther, or to bring Haman to the banquet, as he does on a later occasion in Esther chapter 6 and verse 14. And so they both went to the banquet. Verse 6. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." And so the king asked Queen Esther, "What is your request?" Just as he did in Esther 5 and 3. She said, "Come today to the banquet." Esther 5 and 4. Now, while at the banquet, as the king and Haman drank their wine, the king asked Esther, "What is your request? Up to half the kingdom." The king knew that she had not made her actual request or her true petition. And so he assured her, "It shall be done." So for whatever reason, if she was delaying, whatever her reason, the king recognized that her true petition was not that he come to the banquet. There was something else. In chapter 5, verse 7, then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." And so, verse 7, Esther answered the king, and she told the king that she would do as he said, to tell him her petition and request. She would do this tomorrow. If it pleased the king for him and Haman to come to a second banquet tomorrow, which she would prepare. And so she said tomorrow she would reveal her request. Again, Esther appears to be proceeding deliberately. If one banquet pleased the king, perhaps a second one would please him all the more. Knowing the pride of Haman, she may have invited him the second time, thinking that his prideful heart may lead him to think her petition was for him. Of course, it was not. Number 2, we see in verses 9 through 14, Haman's plot against Mordecai. Verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So Haman left happy that day from the banquet. However, that all changed on the way home when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate. It says Mordecai did not stand or tremble before him. After Haman was promoted by king, you remember how Mordecai did not bow and he did not pay homage to Haman. And as a result, Haman was filled with wrath in Esther chapter 3 and verse 5. Now, even with the decree against his people, the Jews, Mordecai would not tremble before him. Perhaps he thought that with the decree of destruction against his people, perhaps he would now tremble in fear, terrified before him, or perhaps plead to him, but he did not. Verse 10. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and for his wife, Zeresh. This is probably the smartest, wisest thing that Haman has done. He restrained himself. If only he would have restrained himself more, he would have been a wiser man. But he's much like one of the fools that we see described by Solomon in the book of Proverbs. Immoral, wicked. Verse 10. Despite being filled with indignation, Haman controlled himself. He exercised some self-control. And if Haman could do it, I suppose anybody could. But he sure didn't do it for long. The decree he issued called for the people of Mordecai to be destroyed. And he restrained his wrath. He held it in, and he went home. He then called for his friends and for his wife, Zeresh. As people often do, he felt like he needed to vent. And so he called for his friends and he called for his wife so that he could talk with them. Verse 11. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And so first, Haman boasted. He boasted before his friends. This may have been a way to feel better over the behavior of Mordecai toward him. He boasted of his money. He boasted of his children. He boasted of his promotion. And he boasted how he was above everyone else. This is much like people do today. Haman said that he was above the officials and the servants of the king. Esther chapter 3 and verse 1. He had no doubt that he had Mordecai in mind. Think about it. He went home angry, wrathful. He held it in, he restrained himself. Then he got home and he began to boast of his accomplishments to his friends and wife. Yes, he no doubt had Mordecai in mind all this time. Here we read of the children of Mordecai, or the children of Haman, rather. In all the other occurrences in the book, the term is translated son or sons, and some versions read sons in this passage. And so while children could refer to both male and female offspring, we do see specifically his sons mentioned later in the book. And so the author of the Book of Esther mentions the 10 sons of Haman later on in Esther 9 and 10. So that word there translated children can mean children. It can also mean specifically sons. Depending on the context, we see that Haman also spoke of his great riches. He had offered, for example, to pay 10,000 talents of silver money into the treasury of the king back in Esther chapter 3 and 9 and Esther chapter 4 and verse 7. And so we see him boasting of his money, of his children, of his promotions, of how he was advanced above everyone else in the kingdom by the king. Verse 12. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. And so Haman continues to boast. Haman boasted that Queen Esther had invited only him to come in with the king to the banquet that day. And so he relives some of those happy memories. He also boasted of how he was again invited by Queen Esther to go to a second banquet tomorrow with the king. No one else was invited. And so he boasts of his good fortune. Verse 13. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Haman finished listing all his accomplishments before his friends and wife. He wanted people to revere him. Yet, despite all of his success, he could feel no satisfaction as long as Mordecai the Jew was still sitting at the king's gate. Mordecai did not respect Haman. While all of these things might bring Haman honor, they were no avail as long as Mordecai so shamed him in his mind. His wrath and his indignation for Mordecai ruined his joy of success. Oftentimes that's the case with envy and jealousy. It ruins what we have. In this case, pride, that this man would not bow or pay homage to him. And now he would not tremble before him, the same one who wrote the decree against his people. And yet he still stood. Verse 14. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman. So he had the gallows made. So we see Haman's wife, Zeresh, and his friends give Haman their suggestions for how to deal with Mordecai. We see that the word friends can also refer to the wise men who counseled Haman. And so they recommended that a gallows be made 50 cubits high. As a cubit was about 18 inches, at about 50 cubits, that would make the gallows about 75 feet high. The suggestion was that Mordecai be hanged high so that everyone could see and tremble. This Mordecai did not bow and pay me homage. He did not tremble in my presence. And so perhaps as a deterrent, or perhaps as a means of instilling fear in the people, or simply revenge upon Haman. So they recommended that Haman make the suggestion in the morning to the king of hanging Haman or hanging Mordecai, and afterwards go merrily with the king to the banquet. So what does this say about the character of Haman's wife? What does this say about the character of Haman's friends? What about his counselors? Furthermore, what does this say of Haman, who then had the gallows made with every intention of hanging a man followed by enjoying himself at a banquet, drinking wine. Remember, this Haman is the same man who planned to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom because a Jew named Mordecai did not bow and pay homage to him. Again, we mentioned before that the Hebrew term rendered gallows is a word literally meaning tree or wood. Interestingly, a gallows tree is another name for a gallows. And so, whatever its specific design, we see that the condemned were hanged for all to see. Earlier, those who plotted to kill the king were discovered by Mordecai and were hanged on a gallows in Esther 2 and 23. That brings us to the close of the chapter today. We invite you to come back next time for the following lesson. We hope that the lesson has been beneficial today. We encourage you to continue your study of the Book of Esther. We hope to see you next time. And until then, we wish God's blessing upon you. Thank you for being here today.